is Rebecca Topness. She got her BS from William and Mary. She did a double major there in geology and environmental science, as you can do here if you're interested. There, while at William and Mary, her research was using lake records to learn about past fires and wildfires. She's now a Ph.D. student at the University at Buffalo, where she uses lake records to study past changes in precipitation in Western New York. And that's what we're going to be hearing about today. And so I will pass it on now to Rebecca.
All right, hopefully that's okay. How do I do it? All right, hi everyone. I'm super excited to talk with you today about the fieldwork I've been doing for my PhD, studying lakes in Western New York and thinking about past climate change. So I wanted to take a minute to talk about my title. So I titled my talk Lakes and Mistakes. And I titled it this for, I guess, two reasons. First, because when I thought of this title, like it rhymes so well, like lakes and mistakes. I just had to like go with it. And also because lakes and mistakes are kind of the two overarching things I wanted to talk about today. So lakes, because they're a big part of what I study. And I think lakes are super cool. And hopefully by the end of this talk, you will also think lakes are cool if you don't already. And mistakes, because as a second year PhD student, I'm still learning how to make mistakes, whether that's stuff that goes wrong while you're doing field work, your code doesn't work the first time or the first 20 times. So making mistakes is, to me, a big part of science. And so I also wanted to share that as part of my talk. So I wanted to first talk a little bit about my kind of pathway into geology and how I got here. So this picture, I'm here in the orange shirt, probably about 7 or 8 years old, visiting this rock and mineral museum near my house where I grew up. And I thought this picture was really funny because I'm like totally like zoned in on the rocks and minerals. Like I'm not even paying attention to my friends. I'm like, this is super cool. I'm really interested in this. So maybe that should have signaled that I'll have a future in geology, but I didn't really know at the time that that's where I would end up. So then, like Michaela said, I went to William and Mary where I studied geology and environmental science. And this was where I took my first geology class, and I started getting really interested in climate change and learning about why lakes are so cool. So to me, lakes are cool because they are archives of past climate change. So we can use them to investigate what climate was like in the past. So year over year, lakes kind of deposit these layers of sediment at the bottom of the lake basin. And those layers of sediment preserve information of what climate was like at the time. So when we can go out to our lake, we can take a nice core of sediment, and this gives us kind of this, this record of climate going back through time. You can kind of think of it like a layer cake, how those sediment layers are piling up. And looking to the past, using these lake sediment records is important because our observations of climate only go back so far. So we have observations going back to about 1880. And this only records kind of the climate change we're seeing today. It doesn't show any climate changes warmer than present. So only about that like 1 degree Celsius change or a little more. We can't explore climate change more than that using our observations. So that's why we use lake sediment records and look into the past. So this plot is showing temperature going back around 20,000 years into the past. And we can see that climate changed a lot over these past 20,000 years. We've got a lot of wiggles up and down. We've got some of these really rapid warming events that we could use to maybe think about how climate might in the future. And so that's why these past records are really important. So how do we reconstruct climate in the past? We have to use something that helps us measure what we can't directly measure. So this is what a proxy is. It allows us to indirectly measure something. So when I first learned about proxies and lake sediment cores, I really had kind of a hard time like wrapping my mind around it. So I'll go ahead and share like kind of analogy I use for that, and hopefully it helps you too. So imagine that you have a laundry basket in your room. Hopefully your laundry basket doesn't look like this. But you are just throwing your dirty laundry in there day after day, week after week, maybe months, and it's all piling up like this over time. Then say you finally do your laundry, you're going back through kind of this these layers of your laundry back in time. You could look at, like, for example, the shirts you were wearing. When were you wearing long sleeve shirts? When were you wearing short sleeve shirts or tank tops? And that could be a proxy or an indirect measurement for the temperature or the weather going back through time in your laundry bin. So, of course, as geologists, we don't look at laundry. We look at lake sediment records like this one. But it's kind of the same idea, right? We've got these layers going back through time that are preserving these proxies that allow us to measure climate in the past when we can't directly observe that, of course, because we don't have a time machine. So I'll just give an example of some of these proxies that we look at. One of them is charcoal. So we could look at charcoal going back through time in a sediment core, and this might tell us something about wildfires in the past and when they were happening. We could also look at leaf waxes. So this is kind of the waxy coating on the outside of leaves. And those preserve information about the water cycle, maybe also the types of plants that were growing in the lake catchment. And there's lots of these different proxies that we can find in lake sediments that allow us to indirectly measure what climate was doing in the past. All right, so now I'm a second-year PhD student at the University of Buffalo, where I'm still studying these lakes. I get to go out and do a lot of field work on the lakes, which is super cool. And so this research is what I'll be talking about today. And during my PhD, I learned that lakes are a lot more complicated than maybe I thought before. There's a lot of stuff going on in lakes that can complicate the proxies that are preserved in the lake sediment record. For example, mixing of those like layers of water in the lake. Some lakes mix, some don't. Some lakes have like inflow and outflow, and some don't, or they're closed basin. And also maybe lake size could have a factor. How big is the lake? How deep is the lake? And things like that. And so these are kind of the questions that I'm thinking of as part of my PhD, is really which lake should we target to get these lake sediment records and reconstruct climate in the past, if we know that there's a lot of things that can affect these proxies we're interested in. And so kind of building off of that, looking at which lakes are maybe most sensitive to rapid climate change and which lakes would be best to get these sediment records from and look at climate in the past. So most people in my lab study the Arctic, but I wanted to stay a little closer to home. So I study lakes in Western New York, and I think about climate change in the Great Lakes region. And climate projections show that the Great Lakes region is going to experience a lot of climate change through the upcoming century. So we're looking at 2 to 6 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of the century. So I just wanted to show this figure. So it's showing precipitation change for the top, which is the summer, and the bottom is the winter. And we've got the 2020s through the 2080s. And what it's showing us is that by the end of the century, we're going to see a lot of drier summers and wetter winters. And I don't know about you, but especially living in Buffalo, I don't know if I can imagine a wetter winter. I've only spent one winter in Buffalo, but it was a lot. I remember coming out to my car one morning and it was just like encased in ice. And I was like, what do I do now? Like I worked from home that day. I couldn't even get into my car. So Yeah, that's one thing. And there's a lot of other impacts that these climate changes might have too. For example, flooding. If we're seeing more precipitation, we might see more urban areas getting flooded. Precipitation change will, of course, also impact agriculture, what food we can grow, when we can grow it. And also housing and infrastructure is something that I think about, especially living in Buffalo. I learned recently that Buffalo has the oldest housing stock of any major city in the United States. So over 2/3 of the houses were built before 1940. My house was built in 1920. So these old houses might not be as prepared or as weatherized as they could be for these climate changes we're expecting to see. So learning about climate in the past and using that to help think about how future changes might affect us can be really important preparing for these changes. All right. So using these lake sediment records, we can think about which lakes are most sensitive to rapid climate change. Like I said, to get that best record for what we could use to think about future climate change. And to kind of get at this question, which lakes are most sensitive to rapid climate change, I use a lake model. So it's called a proxy system model, and it basically is a series of equations to describe lake processes. So it's a bunch of files with all these code, kind of like I showed here, and it's simulating a real life lake in this model that we're looking at. So here's kind of another schematic of what that model kind of looks like. So we input climate data into the model. So I tell it like what the air temperature is, what the surface pressure is, the wind speed, the bathymetry of the lake. So like how big is it? How deep is the lake? What does that basin look like? And then we run the model and we output a bunch of information. So like the lake surface temperature, when is ice forming on the lake? How is the lake level changing? So this can help us really get an idea of what's going on in the lake and kind of test some of these climate changes. But before we can use the model, of course, it needs to be calibrated. We need to fine tune the model to a real life lake and make sure it's working well so that we know that it's giving us kind of the right answers for that lake. And then we can trust our output and trust how the model is working. So the real life lake that I've been conducting fieldwork at to get observations to calibrate this model is this lake here called Red Pond. It's over here kind of in southwestern New York. I think about like an hour from Alfred, so not too far. And this is what it looks like. It's a pretty small lake, only about 1 hectare in size. So you can think of kind of like a soccer field, maybe would be similar to the size. It has kind of this larger west basin and a smaller east basin. And we do all our sampling from kind of this middle point in the lake. So here's a picture of Red Pond during our September visit. So we were visiting the lake about once every month this past year to collect the data and the observations we were interested in. So yeah, I think Red Pond is just gorgeous. So I wanted to share some pictures with you guys from our visits to Red Pond. So this is our September visit. So a pretty sunny day. All right, so don't blink or you'll miss it. So this is September. This is October. We see all the leaves changing, so pretty. And then we have March, so a spring view of the pond now. Okay, I'll do it one more time. September, October, so the fall, and the spring looks something like this. So you might notice that I didn't show a winter photo, and part of that is because I didn't have one from the same angle. I don't know why. So this is kind of what the lake would look like in December. Also very pretty, but you'll see we also have this nice layer of ice on the lake. And during this December visit, it had been pretty warm, so we didn't think there would be as much ice on the lake as there was. And when we got there, we didn't have a great way to break through the ice, so that was kind of a sad field visit. There was too much ice. We couldn't collect the data we wanted to collect, but that's how it goes sometimes with field work. So ended up being okay. Here's a picture of me rowing the boat on the lake, looking pretty cool. This is actually my first time ever doing fieldwork. I didn't do fieldwork as an undergraduate, only when I got to grad school. So all of this was pretty new to me, but I learned a lot about conducting fieldwork and gathering this data from the lakes, which has been really cool. Here's a snapshot of the boats we used to get out on the lake, and some people doing fieldwork. There I am chilling in the back. Probably should be doing something. And here's kind of my point of view into the bottom of the boat with the gear that we're using to collect the data we're interested in. So I'll go through this quickly. So of course we got our field notebook. That's important to take our notes in the field. Also water bottle, very important to stay hydrated while you're doing field work. And then we've got this thing here. This is our water sampler. So it's basically kind of this plastic tube with the caps on the end. We'll lower it down into the lake to the depth we're interested in, snap the caps back on, pull the water up, and we can get a water sample from different depths down in the lake. And then we'll for that to kind of a smaller little vial of that sample. And we're interested in taking water samples because we can then take it back to the lab and analyze the water isotopes that make up that water sample. So elements have different variations called isotopes. And these variations of the element just are different because they have a different number of neutrons. So like oxygen 16 has 8 neutrons, oxygen 18 has 10 neutrons. And these differences in neutrons slightly affect the weight of those different isotopes. And we can use this to our advantage because by measuring the amount of each kind of isotope, we can learn about different processes in the water cycle and kind of trace them to better understand those processes. So I'll give a quick example. So say we have our lake sample, and our lake is kind of made up of a good amount of heavy isotopes and the lighter isotopes. That's what I kind of tried to show with like the bigger circles and the smaller circles. And then say we evaporate a bunch of water out from the lake, those lighter isotopes are going to be evaporated first. So they'll leave our kind of overall pool in the lake, and there'll be more heavy isotopes left behind. And then when we look at our water samples, we'll use this notation, which just is kind of a ratio of the heavy isotope to the light isotope. And we'll use those values to think about processes like evaporation, precipitation amount, and things like that. So isotopes are really useful. The other piece of gear we have here is a sonde. So it's this kind of, I think I have another picture. It's this kind of long blue stick that has a bunch of sensors down here on the bottom. And we'll also drop that into the lake and get a bunch of data, which is so cool. So like I said, it has all these sensors on the bottom. It has a sensor for temperature, so it'll measure how temperature changes going deeper into the lake. It has a sensor for dissolved oxygen, so measuring the amount of oxygen in the water. It has a chlorophyll sensor, so that's looking at the productivity of the lake, if there's any like algae growing in there. It has conductivity, so this is a measure of if there's like dissolved solids in the lake. And the last one is turbidity, so how murky or how kind of cloudy the lake water is. So we get all this data just from this one instrument. And kind of putting that all together, it would look something like this. We'd be out on the lake in our 2 boats, and we'd have kind of 2 teams working with these instruments. So maybe one team dropping the water sampler down, collecting water samples, and then another group doing the sonde and getting all those measurements from the lake. So this is kind of what our results look like. These are all the observations we collected from the lake over this past year, plus a couple months, I think. So this is a lot. So let's break it down a little bit. So I'll start with temperature. So the way I design these plots, we've got our x-axis is the variable, so in this case, temperature in degrees Celsius. We have depth on the y-axis, so going deeper down into the lake. And then I've color-coded each kind of profile by month. So the warmer colors are from our like summer, fall visits to the lake. And then the green and kind of blues are the like spring and winter visits to the lake. So we can, by plotting these all together, we can look at how the lake temperature changed over time. And we can see in the upper 5 meters, there's a lot of change happening, warmer in the summer, colder in the winter. And this makes sense because we know in the summer, the lake, it's warmer. And then in the winter, there's often ice on the lake, it's colder. So that lake temperature is probably responding to air temperature. And then at the bottom, we don't see a lot of change. The values stay the same throughout the whole year. All right, so looking at our hydrogen isotopes. So this is one of the stable isotopes that we measure from our water samples. So again, we've got our hydrogen isotope values on the bottom and depth on the y-axis. And we can also look at the change in isotopes over time from different depths within the lake. So we can see in the summer, we've got more of these enriched values. So we've got more of the heavy isotopes maybe left in the lake. And this could tell us maybe there's more evaporation happening in the summer. And then in the winter, we've got more negative or more depleted values. So more of those light isotopes in the lake water. All right. And the next one we'll look at is dissolved oxygen. So again, we've got all our profiles here. There's a lot of oxygen in the surface of the lake, and then it quickly drops down to 0. There's like no oxygen down here. So that also tells us something interesting. There's not really any way for life to live deep down in the lake. Something that we learned about this lake is in the past, they tried to stock it with fish so people could go fishing, and all the fish just died because there's no oxygen for them to survive down there, which is kind of interesting, kind of spooky about the lake too. There's just like nothing in there. And then chlorophyll is that measure of productivity. So we see this kind of peak in the upper waters in like July, August. So this is kind of like a chlorophyll bloom. So like these algae blooming in the lake in the summer. And the last two, we've got conductivity and turbidity. So conductivity is this measure of if there's any dissolved solids in the lake water. So we see this kind of increase towards the bottom. And what was interesting kind of showing this data to other people at UB and other professors, the conductivity values only go to about 60 microsiemens per centimeter, which is really low for a freshwater lake. Other lakes that people in my department study are more in the hundreds or thousands. So the conductivity values are pretty low. One of my professors described it as like pretty much like rainwater that someone like spit in. Like that's that's pretty much like what this is telling us. And then we have turbidity. So we've got another kind of peak in the upper waters, and this is probably from bacteria or kind of these consumers who are using the sediment in there. All right. So here's that snapshot again of all of the data we collected. And looking at it, we could notice that there's kind of one thing they all have in common. And that's kind of when you get past around 5 or 6 meters down into the lake or so, there's not a lot of change happening throughout the year. The values pretty much stay the same. And so this tells us something interesting about the lake, that maybe it's a meromictic lake. So what this means is that throughout the year, the layers of water don't completely mix. So meromictic, mero means partial, so it's partially mixing. There's some mixing in the upper waters, but then in the bottom layers of water of the lake, there's no mixing happening. They're just kind of sitting there. And that's why we see those values not changing over time. And then, so this contrasts to kind of a dimictic lake, which completely mixes in the fall and the spring. So I'll show a quick of that. So here's the temperature profile for Red Pond again. We see those values not changing in the bottom of the lake over time. But a dimictic lake might look something like this. So in the summer and the winter, the profiles look similar to Red Pond. But in the spring and the fall, we would see like a straight line on that temperature because the water layers are mixing. So they're all kind of coming to that same temperature. So why is Red Pond meromictic? Well, one of the reasons is because the density of the lake water like layers, don't want to mix together because they have different densities. So you could think of like oil and water not wanting to mix together. Another reason could also be just because Red Pond is like super deep. Like you might have not noticed on the axes on my plots, but Red Pond is around 18 meters deep. So that's about 60 feet. And kind of the way I try to visualize that is with like a big semi truck that's about 50 or 60 feet long, and that would like fit within Red Pond. So it's a super deep lake for its size. Remember, it's only about like the size of a soccer field, but it goes around 60 feet deep at its like deepest part of the basin. So this could also contribute to why it's a meromictic lake, because it's just so deep. Those bottom layers of water don't really interact with the surface. All right. So those were kind of our results from our fieldwork. Red Pond is a really interesting lake. It's meromictic. It's a super deep lake. There's some interesting kind of geochemistry stuff going on. So you might even say that Red Pond is outside of ordinary. And then, so the next part is using these observations to calibrate the lake model, the proxy system model, to Red Pond. So that's where those observations will come in. So here's a schematic of the model again. So the inputs and the outputs. And so our observations will come in and comparing to the outputs and making sure that the model represents our lake really well. I also wanted to have like a side note on this. When I came to graduate school, I didn't have that much coding experience. So learning how to use the model, learning how to code in Python had like a bit of a learning curve. But I really like coding. It can definitely be challenging. It's a lot of trial and error. But what I like about coding is that it gives you a really good chance to learn from your mistakes. And making mistakes in coding is a good thing because then you can learn from them and your code gets better. So one kind of funny thing I wanted to share was when I run the model, I create these input files that have all the climate information. And sometimes maybe I'll make a mistake. It's not quite right. So I'll set it up, I'll run the model, and then I'll just get this back. Stop, lake is dry. And that's just like, that's so sad. It's so funny, but it's so sad. The lake is dry. There's nothing you can do then. But hopefully that's not the case, and the model will run, and you'll get your output, and it will look something like this. So this is for our simulated lake in the model. So these are just a couple of the outputs. So we have lake surface temperature, when there's ice forming on the lake, our isotope values for hydrogen and oxygen in the surface lake water, lake level, and mixing depth here. So then what we'll do is we'll plop our observations on top. There they are. And we can kind of compare them with, compare how the model is working versus our observations from the real life lake. So temperature matches up pretty well, but we have like big gaps between our oxygen, hydrogen isotopes, and also the mixing depth, like what's going on there, because we know or we think that Red Pond is meromictic, but the model is showing that it's mixing like a whole bunch of times, like throughout the year, all the way to the bottom. So something probably isn't right there, and there's more calibration, more fine tuning to be done to make sure that our model is performing as best as it can. So what's next? Well, after our model is calibrated, we'll use sensitivity tests to learn how the lake might respond to different kinds of climate change. So this means going in the input file and cranking up the temperature, making it warmer, and seeing how our outputs change. Or what if we add more snow in the winter or less rain in the summer? How is that going to affect our lake here? And something else I'm interested in doing through the course of my PhD is calibrating the lake model to a different lake and seeing how it responds to these types of climate changes. So here's Red Pond again. And here's another lake that I'm interested in. It's a little bit north of Red Pond. It's called Lower Cassadaga Lake. And as you can see, it's a lot bigger than Red Pond. And it also has an inflow and an outflow. So while Red Pond does not have any inflow or outflow. So kind of thinking about these lake processes and using the model to understand how the lake might be responding to climate change could be really useful, and thinking about what also might be preserved in the lake sediment. So I wanted to end with saying that when I was 7 or 8 years old at this rock and mineral museum, I had no idea that I would end up as a PhD student studying geology. But I really love being able to study what I study. I study one of the coolest things. I get to spend all day out on lakes, getting samples. I get to do coding and work with a model. So kind of looking back, maybe the mistakes I made weren't actually mistakes at all, because they led me to where I am today. All right, thank you. And with that, I guess I'll take any questions. Yeah. Can you say it again? The origin of this pond. That's a great question. So here, let me see if I can go back to the map here. Then we'll come back. Okay. So here's Red Pond again. So we think that it's a kettle lake. So what this means is that, so what it means is that when the Laurentide ice sheet was retreating out of New York, it left behind these kind of blocks of ice that got buried by sediment. And those blocks of ice were maybe sitting there for thousands of years. And then when the climate got warm enough, the ice blocks melted out. And then in some cases, we'll get a lake like this. So that's kind of how the lake formed. Yeah.
I certainly enjoy them for your enthusiasm.
Thank you.
But why did you choose this lake?
Great question. Well, part of the reason I chose this lake is because when I got to UB, they were already set up with a lot of this research here that I joined in. But the other reason we chose this lake is because, well, first, it's a natural lake, like I just explained. So those are kind of rare to find in this area. And of course, we're looking at a natural lake rather than a man-made lake. And then also Red Pond is kind of laying on this terminal moraine of the Laurentide ice sheet. So that means it's the furthest extent that the ice sheet came into New York. And then that's where this lake is like sitting on. And so that indicated to us that maybe the sediment record of this lake would go really far back in time, maybe recording like the past 16,000 years or so. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. I think it records around 14,000 years into the past, and that might be partially because of how it formed. So it was this block of ice that didn't melt out for a long time. So if it would have melted out earlier, the lake sediment record might go further back in time. But because it melted out later, it only records from when that ice melted to when it's going forward in time. So that was kind of a long-winded answer, but basically we chose this lake because it's a man-made lake, and we expected the lake sediment to go far back in time. Yes. Yeah, let me go back to that. Maybe. So here's our connectivity again. Ooh, not that. Not what I want. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so overall the values are pretty low, but you're right that it does increase towards the bottom of the lake. And this might be because kind of the bedrock that Red Pond is sitting on is probably carbonates, and that would kind of contribute to some of the dissolved solids that are coming into the lake and maybe settling at the bottom here. So even though Red Pond does not have as high a conductivity as maybe other lakes that have more dissolved solids coming in, it still has probably a little bit of that influence, and that's kind of why we see this trend in our conductivity. Yeah, it could be because let me go back to the picture. One of the reasons this Merrimictic lake is like good for the lake sediment records is because, like I said, that water at the bottom isn't really getting disturbed, so it's nice and kind of quiet at the bottom of the lake, and that's probably why we see these really nice layers forming in our lake sediment. So that's really what you want out of a lake sediment record. It's not getting very disturbed. Everything is just getting preserved really nicely. And then I guess to the other part of your question, that's what I'm trying to figure out. Maybe a Merrimictic lake might respond to or preserve climate change better than other lakes, but that's what we'll figure out with our model. Is that a question? That's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head how long the ones from Red Pond are, but ones I've worked with in the past have been like 2 meters long. It just kind of depends how much sediment the lake has, I guess. Yeah. That's a good question. I don't know if we've calculated residence time on this lake, but because it's a small lake, I guess I would caution to say that the residence time would be pretty short rather than long. Yeah.
Have you tried forcing the model, so change it so it's no longer necessarily being tied to that pond or any other pond, but just whatever you think model?
Oh, no, but that's a good idea. Yeah, something that we were thinking about is maybe tweaking the conductivity values in the model, because that might influence like the density of like the lake water. But yeah, I like that idea, especially because the mixing depth as it is now, like it looks really weird. So yeah. Great question. So the other ones, I guess I kind of like hinted at here. So these, we, besides like charcoal or something more like physical that you can see or like count under a microscope, there's also a lot of these like molecules that are preserved that we'd have to use like geochemistry to kind of get out of the sediment. So the ones I'm showing here, down here are PAHs, which stands for polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which is kind of a mouthful, but I use them in my undergraduate research along with the charcoal because they're produced when organic matter burns. So they're kind of another proxy for wildfires that are happening around the lake. And then this one up here is a GDGT, which I'm not going to try to pronounce what the acronym stands for, but those are also a molecule, I think they're like a lipid that you can use to reconstruct temperature in the past. Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. I would maybe think so. Or kind of like a challenge with the model that we've had is using the climate data we put in. We're not taking wind observations at Red Pond. We're using like climate data from the airport that's nearby. And I kind of had to like scale down the wind a little bit because as I showed in the pictures, like Red Pond is kind of in this bowl that's like surrounded by trees. So it's probably not having a lot of wind and not a lot of mixing. So yeah, I'd imagine if there weren't trees, there probably would be stronger wind, more mixing happening.